Hi, thanks for joining us for a special report online. I'm Brett Baer. If this is your first time aboard, welcome. This is a great forum to continue the conversation with our panel. We want to hear from you, so weigh in, ask us questions, comments. And our panel, Eli Lake, columnist for Bloomberg View, Charles Lane, opinion writer for The Washington Post, and Bill Bennett, former Education Secretary, host of the Bill Bennett Show podcast. And already people are typing in. Dave Levine says, welcome, Bill Bennett. Greetings from Hobie Sound, Florida, greatest location in the nation, even in August. So you have fans in Hobie Sound.
Thank you.
You know, we were talking there at the end about what's next on Capitol Hill, and we have a lot of battles to come, tax reform being really the biggest. What about this effort on the filibuster and getting rid of it? Is it real?
I think it should be, but I'll defer to the local expert here who's I haven't seen the column, but I've heard about the column.
Right.
I don't know why they don't do it. I don't know why the Republicans don't do it.
Well, they fear that
it'll come back to haunt them. But Democrats are going to do whatever they can do. That's pretty clear, whenever they're in power. So, you know, I just think that, it is a pretty obvious course, particularly when you had this recent experience of the health care debate.
Chuck?
They wouldn't do it before 2018 at this point, because they have to know. I mean, the logical thing to do would be to have the Senate and the House locked up again with a somewhat larger majority in the Senate, right? So you have more votes to play with, between 50 and, you know, whatever your number is. 52 is, in a way, too small a margin. They might worry they wouldn't be able to get, just like they couldn't on health care. But there is a theory that the Senate, this was described by Dave Wasserman in Cook Political Report this week, that there's a natural majority in the Senate building because of how red so many of the small rural states, plus Texas around the country, have become, that the Republicans can almost bank on a Senate majority going forward, you know, the next 4 to 6, maybe even 8 years, and that if that plays out, that would, you know, remove their fear that if they got rid of the filibuster, then the Democrats would come back and do it to them again. Mitch McConnell, of course, has always been opposed to this. He believes that it's a sucker's bet, that one of two things will keep happening. First, you won't be able to really keep your whole caucus together on a regular basis for everything. And secondly, there's no such thing as a permanent majority, as his people will tell you. And sure enough, the minute you do this, the Democrats will come back in. But he, if I may, Brett, he's under a little pressure because Trump is capable of sort of, you know, whipping up a sentiment that says go ahead and do it.
What about, Eli, well, first of all, from the traditionalist point of view, like McConnell, he says that makes the Senate the House, essentially majority rule. Two, I think he says that it pushes the extremes more rather than the center of the ideological spectrum.
Well, I think that we just look at how Obamacare went through, and it created this huge backlash. But now that it's become an entitlement that many Americans are used to, there is some sort of political question as to whether or not Republicans will ever get around to really repealing it and replacing it with something better. And that, to me, says there is a need now more than ever to, and I hate to sound like a kind of typical Washington stereotype, but to have these big questions have some sort of give and a take and get a bipartisan consensus, because ultimately that kind of consensus will mean that durability. And instead, what we have is that this is the way that we're going to be governing on big issues, whether it's health care reform or Social Security or things like that, then no one's legislative accomplishments will ever be safe. And I think that that's not in anyone's interest in the end. I'm not arguing here against changing Obamacare, and I understand that many people are really passionate about it, but what I'm saying is that the way in which it was originally done and the way in which the repeal was done, you know, we haven't really addressed anything, and it's hard to know whether any of these kinds of changes are going to be durable.
To Senator McCain's point, and understanding he's not a big luminary now in the conservative world, he said the old way the Senate worked was to, you know, build consensus, try to get the votes across the party, across the aisle, even if you had to make deals to do it. And that's how it worked. Does that go out the window?
Seems to be gone. But what about these reports? I mean, these guys know, or you know, that the president is working with Democrats now on some compromise plan. Is that true? Is he actually talking to Democrats? Does anybody know?
I don't know if we know.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I know he's had conversations.
Well, there was this Lamar Alexander, Patty Murray thing on health care that sort of got going, and I took that a little bit seriously because they're both kind of heavyweights in their respective caucuses, and Patty Murray, let it be remembered, is the one who did the budget deal with Paul Ryan in 2015.
And they did the education thing together, Alexander and Murray.
Yeah, good point. And
That's
I mean, just going back, I'm not saying I advocate doing away with the filibuster for all the reasons these two guys and you have been saying, that, yeah, in a perfect world, we'd have a lot more consensus in the middle. I'm simply looking at it from the narrow point of view of what the Republicans might eventually conclude is their partisan interest.
Sure.
That the alternative to just coming up empty all the time.
If they can't get it done this way, they better hurry up and get it done some way, because the party will leave them.
You know, Alan Gelso did an interview with the Wall Street Journal. I don't know if you guys saw, he's a historian at Gettysburg. He said this is the greatest period of disunity in America other than the Civil War. Civil War is number one. This is number two. I don't know if that's right. I've talked to a number of historians.
Not like the 72 elections. There's a lot of disunity there. Hard hats versus hippies.
Some people say the Gilded Age, but it's for sure. Right. But it's for sure a period of great disunity. The durability, which we'd all like, may come later. Given the balkanization of the parties now, I'm not sure that this isn't inevitable.
I often say at this panel that coming up in 2018, there are 13 Democrats up for re-election in states where Donald Trump won 82% of the counties or more. You just saw in West Virginia, for example, the governor there changed from Democrat to Republican. And Rangers 1994 says, how long do you think before Joe Manchin flips parties if Republicans still hold the Senate after 2018?
Wish I could read Joe Manchin's mind, but that's been predicted many times.
He does meet with the president. Manchin does.
Sure, but Manchin's never really pulled the trigger on that decision, even though a lot of people think it's kind of obvious that he would want to do it.
Well, I think there's one element of this which I don't know the answer to, but we don't know where Trump's base is on some of these core issues that conservatives have been talking about for 30, 40 years. And healthcare may end up being one of them. Yeah. We saw a kind of online, anger at H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, after some of these guys were fired. We saw, a lot of support for Mo Brooks in that race, and then the president siding more on the establishment side. But what is it that, you could say the nationalist populist wing of the Republican Party that felt that traditional party leaders were ignoring them on a number of issues? And Trump is their guy, but is Trump capable of sort of saying, all right, I'm not going to be with you on this, and will they stay with him? So far, that's worked. But how long? And I don't know. I'm not predicting necessarily a backlash, but if you looked on Twitter, there was extraordinary anger from the Breitbart side of the Republican coalition over some of the firings in the National Security Council.
Yeah. What about, I mean, I often wonder if we in Washington and obviously New York look through a different prism and grade the president, the administration, Congress on a different scale than people in the middle of the country look at. For example, they're happy, one, it's not Hillary Clinton. Two, that Neil Gorsuch is on the Supreme Court. Three, that these regulations have come off and corporations feel better. Even though there's not a big legislative win, their scoring is much different than our scoring.
Well, yeah, and they're feeling better and maybe have some reason to. One of the things in the jobs report that was hidden, I saw it on Bloomberg Business, is that the Trump voter did better. Did you see that? The high school graduate, more job opportunities, more jobs than before, than we've seen in a very long time. So that's an explicit reward. I think certain issues, Eli, the border, immigration. I was surprised, I think you're right about the reaction on the McMaster. I was surprised there wasn't more of a reaction from the base on the conversation with the Mexican president. Right. Well, we both know we can't do this, we can't build this wall. I didn't hear shouts and screams because I think people think the president still wants to do it, or he's getting some results anyway. We're getting this 50 or 60% reduction anyway.
Chuck?
I look at this 2018 midterm as probably the most consequential midterm election ever since I've been following politics, which is ever since I've been a kid. Because what's going on here is it's going to be everybody's theory of what's really going on in American politics is finally going to get tested by real voting.
Right.
Yeah.
And nobody in either party, you talk to no matter people much more expert than I am, don't really know.
It's more consequential than 1994 in Bill Clinton when the whole thing turned. And
in part, I would say yes, because we're much farther past the Cold War. We're much farther into the process of polarization. The party coalitions are rapidly changing. Maybe that was the process that began in 1994 is now coming to its culmination.
The Whitewater was just a twinkle in the Senate committee's eyes at the time.
I mean, just to finish the point, I think it will prove a lot of people's theories either true or false, and I think there's so much riding on it for the Democrats because they have bet emotionally so heavily on the idea that by appealing to the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, they can get the House back, that if they don't, then I think the internal division and the crisis that they're experiencing now just becomes that much more
Do you
acute.
know who the leader of the Democratic Party is now?
No. No. No.
Is it Elizabeth Warren? Is it
Nancy Pelosi? I don't know who it is. It's nobody. Is it? Is it anybody? I don't know.
I don't know.
But
What is that question?
I mean, there's an interesting choice here, right? Because let's say Trump triangulates in Clintonian fashion and cuts a deal on health care with Democrats. Well, then how are you going to be, you know, a Democrat who's part of the resistance if you're cutting a deal with the evil Trump? And, you know, if you know, on the one hand, if we would have this conversation hypothetically 3 years ago, you say, of course I want to preserve Obamacare. That's what Democrats have been fighting for what, 70 years. But there's so much invested in defeating and delegitimizing Trump at this point that will they cut off their nose to spite their face? And that's what I think the 2018 race is really about. Because if Democrats win the House, if they get a majority in the House,
it vindicates the resistance.
It not only vindicates the resistance, we can expect that Trump will be impeached. Yes. Not to say that he will be driven from office, but that's clear. I mean,
the
political process will happen. If they control those committees, if you have a Democrat in charge of the House Judiciary Committee, you will get impeachment proceedings.
Do you think they will? Think they'll win the House?
I don't know.
I'll make it.
I'm a national security, foreign policy guy, but I'm just saying that is clear as day that that's what happens.
Hey guys, can you move down the McConnell healthcare failure shot? The Golf 11 says if Mitch McConnell hadn't blocked Garland's nomination, Trump would not be president. Take a listen to McConnell on that issue.
We came up one vote short on our effort to repeal and replace Obamacare, which was deeply disappointing. And I remember thinking it was about 2 o'clock in the morning at the time, well, look at it this way. Hillary Clinton could be president, and Merrick Garland could be on the Supreme Court, and I instantly felt better.
What about that, Bill?
Yeah, people still feel better. But I'm taken by Chuck's point, which is the revelation after the election, and everybody said, gee, we didn't know, we got it wrong. How could we have all gotten it wrong? So many of us. Now we know why. No, we don't. That's what you're saying.
Exactly.
Because everybody's running around with a theory, and there'll be a different theory for everybody running in 2018, and we'll see which one is true. So who really knows what the bottom is here? I don't know. We have to hit certain touch points and see what the reactions are.
You know, the polls in the end, we should point out, were pretty close. I mean, if you look at the popular vote,
numbers,
Hillary Clinton by 3%. The state polls, because there weren't a lot of them and they were not reliable, weren't that accurate. But largely, we had a picture. Now the polls, if you trust them, show a approval rating that is down across the nation for the president in the 30s.
But this goes back to my point before, which is all our paradigms about what it means to have a low presidential approval rating going into 2018. That whole paradigm might be overturned. That doesn't really predict what it used to predict. Just going back to that great piece of footage of Mitch McConnell, you know that moment where he says, well, you know what, and then I thought, but we don't have Hillary Clinton and we do have or we don't have Merrick Garland, that's classic Mitch McConnell, because that's what he's all about, is sort of like making the best of a bad situation. That's his whole approach to government, is, well, at least we got something, or we got the most we could. And that's why he is a skillful and a survivor in a legislature, but I think that same quality alienates the sort of Trump wing of the party, because they see that attitude as all about compromise, and it's not ambitious, and you always are settling. And so, but, you know, you got to respect him. He's willing to stick to it and say it out loud.
No matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, it is a little frustrating that we're always one election away from solving the big problems in our country. We all know what the big pillars are that we have to deal with, but it always seems like we're one election away from being able to do it.
I mean, yes, that is the problem, and I think the one thing about I think Trump has a lot of characteristics in some ways. He's not, I don't want to compare him to anyone, but there's a Clintonian element to him. He gets himself into enormous problems, but he has great faith in his political skills to get himself out of those problems, which reminds me a lot of, you know, Clinton kind of creating his own mess and then trying to get out of it. And I think that he has a way of communicating directly with his core supporters, you know, even though I kind of posed that question before. In such a way that, you know, he can bring them along even when he's not necessarily delivering on everything, because they trust him. And the question is, you know, can he sort of make himself less toxic with the rest of us, so to speak?
All right, a lot of people here, before we wrap up, want to talk about North Korea. Rebecca says, are we going to talk about North Korea anymore? It's the most serious thing going right now. Eli, do you think that this ends up in some kind of military action?
No, I don't, because, you know, as said on the air, what Bill Bennett said, is just that, you know, South Korea is the hostage here. And even though we have to believe James Mattis when he says that there are very deliberate plans in place, it's a high-risk operation to try to take out any of their facilities, which are all over the country, and also deal with those big artillery guns, thousands of them, that are in range in the DMZ. So that's the first point. But the second thing is that if it gets us back into a kind of negotiation, it's very bittersweet. We should not look at that as a victory, even if we get some sort of freeze. And I believe that at this point we're going to have to understand and recognize North Korea as a nuclear power, which is troubling for proliferation in its own right. But, you know, we're going to be counting on one of the worst prison states on the planet to basically, hopefully, keep its word, not to blackmail us again, which they've shown time and again that they will. And I think that that does not mean that the U.S. should invade, or it doesn't mean that the U.S. should send in people to assassinate Kim. These are kind of like sci-fi fantasy things. But it does mean that you should think about this the way that Reagan thought about the Cold War, which is that ultimately by identifying people like Lech Walesa and so forth, we should have an understanding or should prepare for the day that this regime collapses. None of these dictatorships are ever as enduring as they appear, even though it's pretty remarkable that the Kim family regime has lasted into its third generation. They're always rickety. There are always tensions. And when I've talked to North Korean dissidents before, and the country has changed. There are access to these portable DVD players where they're getting South Korean soap operas and things like that. Just saying, these are things that you can't predict. It's not something you bet on. You have to do something to protect us from the nukes, but you have to have an eye as well that it's immoral to just assume that this kind of regime can last forever.
Bill, listening to that 1999 Donald Trump, do you think that some of this is to get Kim Jong-un to a table, to a dialogue, one-on-one? For the longest time, we wanted as a country to not recognize that North Korea was on our same plateau. But North Korea always wanted to be one-on-one in those discussions. That's why we had 6-party talks. Do you think the president really wants to sit in a room and do the art of the deal?
Maybe. I mean, that's what he says first in that tape, right? Let's try that. He has enormous confidence in his ability to deal. Maybe when he sees the other options, for reasons that Eli was just laying out, that he offers that part. But is this guy crazy or not? I have 2 questions. Is Kim Jong-un crazy or not? And can he hit Guam? I mean, can he do this, or will it plunk in the ocean 300 miles from Guam?
We don't know. I think we can go that far. We don't know if he's that.
I don't think he's crazy.
You don't
I think, I mean, listen, he's a monster. but he's coolly rational. He's eliminated his rivals. He's consolidated power. He has played the dictator game well.
When you kill your uncle on the back end of an anti-aircraft gun,
spray VX gas in your half-brother's face.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying he's a total monster, but I'm saying that from the perspective of he wants to survive, and that's what they want to do. That's why they have the nuclear. I mean, that's what North Korean diplomats have said in these Track 2 talks with American former diplomats and academics and stuff, and I think that that's probably right. That
you know, Eli, the North Koreans have a great advantage in this whole thing, which is they are the one party or actor in this whole situation that is clear about its objectives. Crystal clear, has no conflicts of interest. Their prime directive is Kim dynasty remains in power through any means necessary. Everybody else has conflicting objectives,
including
right?
The Chinese.
Including the Chinese, and certainly including us.
Yeah, sure.
And even though they're relatively small, poor, and weak, except militarily, that gives them a big advantage. And they have learned, I think, from the experience of the post-Cold War era, starting in 1991 when they first embarked on this nuclear thing, that basically it's worked for them. It's taken them to the brink a number of times. It's dangerous and risky, but fundamentally it has paid off because here, as Eli points out, here they are in the third generation, and that was the prime directive. So you put all that together, and I think what you get out of it is they're playing their same old playbook. And I guess it's premised on some assumption that Trump isn't really all that different from past American leaders, that he is going to, in the end, sort of be pragmatic and get engaged in some
Well, he's already, by the way, we forget
negotiation.
this, but only a few months ago, remember, he said he'd be honored to talk to him.
Yes.
But I think that is the real...
Yeah. I mean, that's why
underlying.
you got to read The Art of the Deal. This is classic Trump right here, right?
He did have a win at the United Nations Security Council with that unanimous vote. That was a big deal.
Sure, sure. Was there ever any hope for China? Was there ever any hope that China would be very helpful here?
Sure, the president has pinned a lot of hopes on him, and
he kind of fell away after the chocolate cake at Mar-a-Lago.
But they're they're the ultimate conflict of interest there. They don't want this hassle of North Korea, but on the other hand, to them it's preferable to a united Korea that's democratic and allied with the United States. It's not a whole lot of business they're doing with North Korea, but probably some very well-connected party insiders are doing it. And so, you know, you put all that together, and they never end up pulling.
It seems like they use North Korea as a weapon. You know, we're not talking with them about human rights. We're not talking about cybersecurity. We're talking about North Korea every time we talk to them.
It's a buffer.
And it's a buffer. And
but you know what the Chinese really don't want? American force in their part of the world. And that's why one of my, I think it was very effective to tell, the Chinese premier over chocolate cake that we've just struck places in Syria. That message was very effective with the Chinese because they don't like American military power, particularly, in and around the Pacific. And that's something so if you can convince them that there's two ways this can go. You either do it your way or we get involved, and you're not going to like it when we get involved. That is potentially a source of leverage, even though it hasn't worked so far.
Jason says China will never be helpful. We won't have peace until this regime is gone. Does it get to a point where, maybe we are about regime change?
Well, we should keep that as a goal.
Sure. Sure.
The South Koreans, speaking of conflicts of interest, are very ambivalent about that because they feel, even though they want to see the liberation of their cousins and brothers and sisters, they will end up paying for it, and that the cost of rehabilitating the North would be immense and would destabilize their society. So that, in effect, turns into another source of stability for the regime.
All right, here's one more.
Was that about regime change in China or North Korea?
North Korea.
Oh, North Korea. All right. The softening effects of capitalism haven't really overwhelmed China.
Well, will we?
Most favored nation thing with my buddies Kemp and Rumsfeld and. No, anyway.
So why don't we go after the Chinese banks that do business with North Korea?
We should. I think much more aggressively. I'm a Gordon Chang guy there. Yeah.
All right, one more question down the row. If this drags out and this tension continues for a long time, do we send U.S. athletes to the Olympics in Seoul, February 2018?
Yes.
I don't see why not.
Yes.
We're South Korea's ally. I mean, no, we're not.
Particularly if they're good.
You've
I mean, if they're really good.
You've actually just identified another very good reason this thing won't come to a military conflict, because Seoul really wants to have those Olympics come off.
But how much influence does Seoul have over Kim Jong-un?
Well, they have influence over us, and I don't think we can go to war in their country without their cooperation, but maybe we will.
Well, this has been a fun discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Special Report Online. We do it every Wednesday. Control room, a little goodbye.